Hi everyone, it's Pastor Wagner. This is my weekly video blog. Today I want to talk about whether or not the extra kids that Eve had due to the curse are the non-elect people or not. There is an idea that is being promoted out there that I've heard that election kind of goes like this, that had the fall not happened, then Adam and Eve would have had a bunch of children, and all of those children and all of their posterity would have been all sinless and innocent, and they would have lived forever just like Adam and Eve if sin hadn't entered into the world and if those children themselves had not sinned. And that's true. If no sin would have entered, then there's no death, because the wages of sin is death. And then, so then the curse was placed on Eve when the fall happened. And when that happened, it was said in Genesis 3:16 that Eve was cursed with multiplied conception. Genesis 3:16, it says, "Unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." So part of Eve's curse was that her conception would be multiplied. As we know, conception is how babies are born. So she would conceive more babies as part of the fall. So it's then claimed that these extra children that would be that would be conceived due to the extra conception, that these extra children would be the non-elect. That the elect would have been the original kids that would have all been born sinless and would have never died. And all of the extra kids, due to the extra conception, these would have been the non-elect. So this is the idea that's being offered out there. But what does Genesis 3:16 actually teach? I'm of a mind to think that generally the most simple explanation and the most obvious explanation of a text should be given due consideration before any other elaborate or fanciful interpretation be considered. So what does the text just plainly say? What is it? It means what it says. Well, what does it actually say? Well, the simplest explanation is actually found in the text itself. Did you notice what it said there? It says, "In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." Well, right there's the explanation of the text. What is the point of the multiplied conception? It's multiplied sorrow. Increased painful childbirth was part of Eve's curse. Remember what it says there, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." So the sorrow that would be multiplied to her would be the sorrow of bearing children. And God would increase that sorrow. He would multiply that sorrow. So more conceptions means more childbirth, or at least either more childbirth or more miscarriages. Either one are sorrowful. So more conceptions equals more childbirth equals more pain and more sorrow. So that was part of the curse, that Eve would endure more sorrow because of more childbirths. That would be the most plain and straightforward and obvious interpretation of the text without getting into anything else. So I always go with what is the most simple and obvious explanation, and that's it. But let's look at some of the problems with this idea that I just gave at the beginning. Problem number one, where does the Bible actually teach it? That's a question. I mean, there's an interpretation here of Genesis 3:16, but where else in the Bible does the Bible teach this idea? And the answer is, that I've found, is it doesn't. There is no place in the Bible that teaches this. The Bible teaches that election is by grace, not by race. In Romans 11 and verse 5, it says, "Even so then, at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace." So election is according to grace, not race, not your blood lineage, not who you were born from, or any such thing. It's by grace alone. Grace is favor, favorable or benignant regard, or its manifestation, now only on the part of a superior. Favor or goodwill in contradistinction to right or obligation as the ground of a concession. So there's an interesting part there in the definition of grace. Grace is in contradistinction to right or obligation. So if you are elected because of a right that you have, or because of an obligation that God has, it's not grace. You see, if the original kids, the ones that prior to the fall that would have been born, if the original kids are the elect, then they each individually have a right to be elected, and God would be obliged to elect them because of their descent, based on their descent. Now, this is the antithesis of grace. If God is obliged to elect them because, after all, they are the original kids, then it's not grace because God's obliged. If they have a right to be elected because they're the original kids and not the extras, then it's not grace. You see? The Bible teaches that God's children are not born of blood, which would be their race or their family line, but of God. John 1:12 through 13 says, "But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God." The children of God are not born of blood. It doesn't matter who they're born from, whether they're one of the originals or one of the extras. That's not how they get to be born again. They get to be born again of God. They're saved by grace, not by race. The Bible teaches that prior to God's election, that all of mankind were one fallen lump, one group, and they're all exactly the same, identical in God's sight. They're all a lump of fallen sinners. There's not two groups. Romans 9 and verse 21 says, "Hath not the potter power over the clay of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor and another unto dishonor?" There's not an honorable lump and a dishonorable lump. There's not the original lump and the extra lump. There's one lump. What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory, even us, whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. It's not of race. It's not the Jews. It's not just the Gentiles. It's not one family line or multiple family lines. It is one big, fat, nasty lump of sinners. So prior to God's election, God viewed all of mankind exactly the same, just as one fallen lump. God did not view them as two groups, the originals and the extras. No two groups here, one lump. Remember that, that's very important. Now let's look at a second problem with this idea. The second problem has to do with the implications. Just let's go through let's reason this out to its logical conclusion. Let's look at the implications of this idea. So if the non-elect are the extra kids, which would never have existed if the fall had not occurred, then let's consider some things. Cain would have been one of these non-elect extras, right? Because we are told in 1 John 3 and verse 12 that Cain was of that wicked one. So Cain was not one of the elect. So under this idea, Cain would have been one of the extras, right? He would have never been born had the fall not happened, okay, under this idea. That means that if Cain would have never been born, if the fall had not happened, then neither would any of Cain's kids have been born, right? If Cain wasn't born, Cain's kids couldn't be born. If my dad was never born, I wouldn't be born. It's not possible for any of Cain's kids to be born if Cain was never born. And Cain, under this idea, Cain would have never been born if Eve would have not sinned and Adam would not have sinned, right? So Cain was an extra, and therefore Cain's kids are extras. Because remember, Cain's kids can't be born unless Cain was born, right? So Cain is an extra, Cain's kids are extras. Now, since Cain's kids would never have been born if the fall had not happened, then neither would their kids have been born, all right? If Cain was never born, Cain's kids could never have been born, and if Cain's kids could never have been born, then their kids would have never been born. So therefore, Cain's grandkids would all be extras, would all be non-elect extras, right? Cain, his kids, his grandkids, and so on, and their kids, and their kids. The whole lineage coming from Cain, an entire bloodline, an entire family, would all be extras, because remember, none of them would have existed if the fall had not happened, according to this idea. Remember, the conception was multiplied according to this idea, and all of the multiplied conception were the unelect, and Cain was one of the unelect. So Cain and his whole family line would have never existed if it weren't for the fall. So therefore, this idea essentially teaches two-seedism. I don't know if you've ever heard of two-seedism before, but it is a heresy out there that it goes, I think, under different forms, but the idea is that the devil propagated a race through Eve, and that's where Cain and all the wicked people came from, and then all the other ones came from Adam, is the idea. And that lineage goes down through time, and anyway. So basically there's two lines of humanity under two-seedism. One are the wicked and one are the righteous. And that's basically what this doctrine is essentially teaching, as far as I can tell. That's the logical implication of it. Though somebody that teaches it probably wouldn't say I believe in two-seedism, but that's the logical implication of it. But this idea is false. And here's the reason. Because God has chosen his elect out of every kindred, that's every family, out of every tongue, which is a language, out of every people, which is an ethnic group, and out of every nation. We read in Revelation 5 and verse 9, "And they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, and tongue, and people, and nation." God has redeemed people from every kindred. A kindred is the being of kin, relationship by blood or descent. So every descent line coming throughout history, family lines, including the line of Cain, all of those descents have God's elect in them. But we just saw that if we take this doctrine to its logical conclusion, the whole line of Cain would have never existed if it weren't for the fall and if it weren't for the multiplied conception, according to this idea that the multiplied conception came about because of the fall, which is true, and that the multiplied conception would be the non-elect, which I say is not true. So Cain's whole line would have been non-elect, but according to Revelation 5:9, that's not the case. God has his elect in every kindred, not just in the original kindreds, but in every kindred. So if this idea is reasoned out to its logical conclusion, there would be entire families and bloodlines of people who are not elect. And that's false, based on what we've just read. Remember, salvation is by grace, not by race. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next week, Lord willing.